See what God does next. She stood before the world, a symbol of strength, beauty. Explore what does next. And relentless humanitarian drive. Hollywood adored her. The world watched her. Hand does next. But behind the cameras, behind the flashing lights and red carpets, they go what legends what does next. There was a woman searching for more than fame, more than applause. When we go. Angelina had next. Angeloli had traveled the world, walked through war zones. When we let go opens. Cradled orphaned children in her arms, and faced injustice with bold defiance. When God does next. But there was something missing. Something deeper. A whisper her soul had been chasing for years. What God does next. It didn't happen in a palace or on a grand stage. It happened in silence. In the stillness of a refugee tent in Syria. Let gongst. It happened when she sat beside a grieving mother who had lost her entire family. Yet see what God does next. Yet still clutched the Qur'an with a peace that baffled the human mind. That moment, Jolie, I would later confess, was the plot go and see what it see. The beginning of a transformation she never saw coming. She had read scripts that moved millions. Today happened see what God does next. But no words had pierced her heart like the verses spoken in soft Arabic that night. And see what does next. She didn't know the language. She didn't understand the words. When he let God does next. But the tears in the woman's eyes, the strength in her voice, and the cerise what go her does see, and the severed sanity on her face, something ancient in Jolie's soul. That night, she didn't sleep. She stayed awake. See what dozens. Staring at the stars above the broken camp, replaying the moment again and again. When what God does next. How could someone who had lost everything still believe she had everything? How could pain and peace live in the same heart? She needed to know God does next. What began as curiosity became obsession. Today, what God does next. Jolie sought out a translator the next morning. She asked, what was she saying? What was in that book? The interpreter smiled softly and began to read from the Qur'an. In English, Jolie listened. The words were calm but heavy, gentle yet shaking. It was let God does next. It was like the book wasn't speaking to the world. It was speaking to her. Dude, and that's how it started. Not with a declaration. Not with a conversion. Next, but with a question. A search. A journey into the unknown. She read the Quran in private, page by page, verse by verse. When we let go and doze next, and every time she turned a page, something turned inside her. She found stories she had never heard. Stories of prophets who stood firm in truth. of women honored and protected, of orphans cherished and justice demanded. Hurry and see what does next. The Quran didn't speak like a philosopher. It spoke like a creator. What God does next, not offering theories, but commands. Not seeking to please, but to awaken. She had grown up in a world where faith was optional, where spirituality was treated like decoration. But this was different. Islam wasn't just a religion. It was a way of life, a way of being. A day and see what gottens. A reminder that you are never alone, never forgotten, and always accountable. Who let go and does next. In the Quran, she found answers to questions that haunted her. Why do people suffer? Why is there injustice? What happens after death? How does one heal a broken heart? And see what God does next. And perhaps the question that echoed loudest in her soul. What is the purpose of life? Angelina had lived in extremes. She had seen luxury, and she had seen famine. She what God does next. She had worn $1,000 dresses and held starving children. She had experienced fame and isolation. But the Quran introduced her to balance, to humility, to purpose. Dare and see what God does next. She didn't need to change her identity to appreciate the truth in its words. She only had to open her heart. She began to notice things. The way Muslims greeted each other with peace. The way they prayed. God does next. Not just with words, but with their entire bodies bowed in surrender. Today we learn see what God does next. The way charity wasn't an option but an obligation. The way family was honored. And mothers see what duxed, mothers were revered. The way discipline was taught. And desires were mastered. The way justice was demanded. Go and oppression condemned. She traveled again to the Middle East, when to let go, not as an actress, not even as an activist, but as a seeker. She sat sat with scholars, with women, with children memorizing the Quran. She asked questions. She listened. She cried. And slowly, today we guess what God is next. Her worldview began to change. Islam wasn't what she had seen on the news. Happens when we go and see what does next. It wasn't the screaming headlines or the violent misrepresentations. It was beauty. It was discipline. It was mercy. Galepans wore what God does next. It was the voice of a creator who knew her better than she knew herself. And as she studied, her heart softened. Her ego fell. Her soul quieted. When will happens what God's next? There was a verse that struck her deeper than any scene she had ever performed in. Next. Verily, it said, verily, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest. That was it. That was Hod does next. That was the rest she had been searching for all her life. The peace see what God's next. The peace no camera could capture. The light no stage could provide. The let God does next. The love no award could offer. Jolie didn't make a public announcement. Hey, Leto does next. She didn't hold a press conference. This journey wasn't for headlines. It was for healing, quiet, sacred, personal. She began to fast, God fast, during Ramadan out of respect, and found clarity in the hunger. She began to read more hadiths. Today, what happens, what does next? Understanding the Prophet Muhammad, not through stereotypes, but through his mercy, his kindness, his justice. Daddy, she swore does next. She said he was the kind of man this world desperately needed. One let does next. One night in Jordan, she heard the Adhan echo across the city. Dasi, the call to prayer. It wasn't background noise. It was a call to the soul. She stood still, and tears streamed down her face. It felt like home. Next, like truth was no longer hidden. Like the answers were never far. There we go, and's what happens. They were always right there, waiting for her to ask the right questions. Their explore what go was one thing that changed everything. One verse that she read again and again. So whoever does next. So whoever's an atom's weight of good will see it. When whoever goes, when whoever does next. And whoever an atom's weight of evil will see it. She what next? She realized nothing goes unseen. Not the pain she endured. Count not the good she tried to do. Not the moments she failed. Not the prayers she whispered in the dark. All of it matters. All of it counts. And Ethan, and we go and see all of it God returns. Angelina didn't need religion to become famous. Does next. She didn't need Islam to find a cause. Today we explore go and see what does next. But she needed something to fill the part of her soul that all the fame in the world couldn't reach. What does next? The Qur'an didn't just speak to her mind. It reached explore what God does next. It reached into her heart and rewrote the narrative. Next. It turned her pain into purpose, her wandering into direction, her questions into clarity. She began next. She carry a small copy of the Qur'an with her, not for show. Today and see, not for headlines, but because it reminded her who she was trying to become. A woman of compassion, a woman of principle, a woman of faith. She never claimed perfection. She never claimed to know it all. We led does next. But she knew one thing for sure, something had changed. And once see what does next. And once truth touches your heart, you can never go back. Like, who'd God does? The end, or in conclusion. may break the emotional tone or immersion of a powerful motivational video. What God does next. A natural emotional close is more effective.